For me, it doesn't show me who you are. It just shows me who you think you need to be. Mission Accepted Season 2, Episode 5. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
I'm excited to have you on to share your application. Thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing your application to help other students potentially coming from similar situations as yourself, as an immigrant to this country, overcoming lots of obstacles along the way to end up with that acceptance to medical school. So I'm excited to chat with you today, and I'm excited to share your application and show students what you did great, what you potentially could have improved on, and everything in between. Does that sound good?
Perfect. Yeah, let's
So
go ahead.
I would love to hear from you. Why do you think you were successful with this application cycle, your first application cycle?
I believe it was the application. Learning about how each applicant and just the profiles of the schools that I was interested in. I knew I definitely did not have the best statistics, like, the best MCAT or the best GPA. But I think after learning how the application process worked and how I had to present myself through my application, it really made a big difference. I think that if I would have minimized the impact of my writing and how is that I had to answer the questions, it would not have turned out the way it turned out. And in some ways, like how you said, I have no role model. I don't have close friends that have applied to medical school per se.
Yeah.
So my guidance was just through your books, going to each school websites, and I did not have an advisor either. So
yeah. Did you have this book, the medical school application process book?
Nope.
You did not. Okay. So I want for the audience to know, like, you haven't watched Application Renovation, Mission Accepted.
No.
The two books it sounds like that you had were my interview book and my personal statement book.
Yes.
And so you will see, as we're going through this, a lot of how you wrote the activity descriptions is actually not very much how I recommend writing them. And there are some strengths and some weaknesses here and there throughout your application. But at the end of the day, you were accepted. So there was something in your application that resonated. You said you watched one of my videos. Which one of that videos was that?
So it was the disadvantaged one. So I really did not know about you per se until like April of this year, because I think there's a lot of pre-meds that get really distracted with Reddit, Student Doctor Network, so many information out there.
Yeah.
I did not want to do that to myself.
Yeah.
So all I did was focus on my MCAT, and that's all I did until I finished the MCAT. And then I watched your disadvantaged video because I had to convince myself that I knew I was disadvantaged, but I didn't want to use that in my application. So I watched your disadvantage video a couple of times to really think it through. Okay. And that was the first one.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive in, and we'll kind of pick apart your application, show students what you did and what ultimately got you accepted into medical school. So as we're looking through here, the first thing I always love to look at is when you submitted your application, and you must have heard through the grapevines that submitting early is important, because you did that. You submitted June 10th, which is awesome. And you can see that it still took over a month to verify your application, which is just crazy. So good job submitting early. We get to the disadvantaged essay, as we talked about, and I put a note here, very strong disadvantaged essay. And it makes sense, you watched my video, so good job. You watched it lots of times, you said. And at the end of the day, students are very concerned when it comes to the disadvantaged essay about feeling pitied. They're concerned that how they write their disadvantaged essay, it's going to look like they're going to be pitied, and they don't want to be pitied. Nobody wants to be pitied, right? That's not a good feeling to have for someone else to have about ourselves. But for you as an immigrant to this country, just being an immigrant alone for the most part makes many people disadvantaged, because you're learning to adjust to a new culture, a new language, a new educational system, new everything. And so that alone is usually enough to mark yourself as disadvantaged. And then when you add in other things that you talked about, you go, oh, that makes complete sense. And I like to think of the disadvantaged essay as a context essay. This gives the readers, the reviewers of your application, context into who you are, where you've come from, what you've been through, to allow me to look at your activities, look at your grades, look at your MCAT score, and go, okay, through the lens of the disadvantaged essay, I can now put your GPA into context. Through the lens of your disadvantaged essay, I can now understand your MCAT score, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a context essay, and you did a great job giving context to the reader. Now, one of the things that was very interesting here, talking about kind of where you're from and the exposure that you had, you got into healthcare here, and you don't have to. You got into talking about the exposure to healthcare and understanding healthcare kind of disparities, and you don't have to use this essay as a kind of why medicine extension essay. So that's one thing you did that you don't have to do, but it was a very strong essay overall. So great job with that. And then we get to an institutional action essay. Now, institutional actions, lots of students are scared of them. Is it going to keep me out of medical school? You're an N of 1 that shows, no, for you, it doesn't. And for most schools, they're not going to screen out specifically for having an institutional action. So great job with your institutional action essay. It's very straightforward, right? Here's what I went through. Here's what happened. Here's what I've learned from it. Here's how I've improved. Great kind of structure and format of that institutional action essay. Answering the question, not going into the weeds where it's not needed. The one thing you did have here is that you talked about kids. And this is always a question that comes up with parents who have kids, is do I mention them in my application? What was your thought process here for mentioning that you were pumping to feed your 5-month-old?
Well, it was the real issue.
Yeah.
I couldn't make up another excuse other than it was the real issue.
Yeah.
Sadly, I struggle a lot with nausea. So even when I was pumping, I would have to go out of class, pump milk, come back. By the time I came back, part of the lecture was already, done. It was a real struggle. So I was not fearful of what my story had to tell.
And that's the perfect answer, right? You put it in there because it's your truth. At the end of the day, that's what I want everyone to understand, is your truth will set you free. And if your truth is you have a kid, then put you have a kid. And specifically answering this question, right? The reason for your institutional action potentially is the distraction that a kid is, and everything that comes with being a parent. It distracted you from being a student, being a top-notch learner. And that is your truth. Now, for other people, their institutional action may be something completely different. And yes, they may be a parent as well, but the institutional action has nothing to do with that, right? And so insert these kind of touchy, do I mention I'm a parent? Do I not mention I'm a parent? Insert it where it's important and insert it where it's the truth. And that's what you did here. So great job. All right, so we continue on into your transcripts and we get to your grades. And you struggled. You struggled a lot very early on and throughout your undergrad. What was going on in terms of getting these grades? We got some D's and some C's and an F in there. Human anatomy and physiology kind of kicked your butt not once but twice. What's going on with the grades early on?
Okay, so there's two sections to this. One is that I really was disadvantaged in the sense that I had never written a paper in my life until I got to college. So having to adjust to the educational system was really a struggle. Also, moving from a highly populated place to like a city like Lima to, a little town, a rural town in the north of the US was definitely shocking for me.
Yeah. So
I also did not think my goals were going to go any farther than a bachelor's degree. I thought, oh, I just need to graduate. It was in some ways maturity. I was not mature enough. I ignored the impact of what low grades would have in case I had envisioned, a higher degree. I did not prepare myself for that, as you can see. I
Yeah.
was just trying to make it. And then for the anatomy and physiology, the curriculum of my program had this class, even though I had no science background and I did not know it. I was misinformed, and this course was done online. I was
Okay.
very scared of asking, hey, this is happening in my city. In where I live, it rarely snows, but there was one year in 2013 that it did,
Uh-oh.
and it shut down the entire state. And I'm trying to explain to someone in the north that, and it just didn't click. So it was misinformation. It was just not being able to be so engaged. And
Yeah.
I think you can see that.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So we get to kind of the end of your normal undergraduate years, and again, not a great track record there. And so it makes sense, right? You again, as an immigrant to this country, not potentially seeing yourself from a cultural standpoint as well, as a woman, not seeing yourself going on and doing these things, even though maybe internally you had aspirations. Externally, there were lots of doubts, lots of lack of mentorship and seeing other people like yourself who have done this. It's a very common story that I hear from students who have struggled early on, lacking that kind of belief in themselves and that understanding that they can do it, and then figuring it out later on and going, okay, I'm here. So you did that. We have your graduate studies, which where your institutional action was from your graduate studies, and so some struggles there. And then we get to your postback, which is a couple years after, and all of a sudden we see lots of A's, right? It's like, hey, I figured it out. I finally figured it out. What do you think it was that finally clicked for you, that you could get good grades? Was it really just the internal dialogue of like, I can do this, so I'm going to do it?
No, so I did not know, and that's something that I wanted to mention. I did not know I had the seat I had, even when I was doing the prereqs. What happened was on my first test in algebra, because I didn't even take algebra in college. So I signed up to take algebra in a community college. My first test score was 60. I was like, I can't do science. This is the end of my life. I can't do anything else. From there, I talked to my professor, my instructor. She's like, you can study. So I started studying I was working at the ER at the time, started reading, learn how I learned. So I actually became aware that my learning style was very listening to lectures.
Yeah.
So in the place where I live, we drive a lot, like at least 30 minutes everywhere. So I would listen to the lectures. And I think learning how I learned and really enjoying what I was learning was fascinating. And that's what clicked. That's what gave me okay. After that, I started making the grades that I was making because I was enjoying learning, because now I knew how to learn.
Nice. I love it. And I'm very much an oral learner as well, listening and learning that way. Lots of podcasts, lots of audiobooks. All right, so we get to your GPA calculations, and we can see here that looking at your kind of trends, especially your science trends, 2.0, 1.5, and 0.93. Luckily, you didn't have a lot of credit hours for those science grades. Because you were able to then go and crush your postback and get a 398 GPA with 41 hours. And kind of the magical number we always talk about is about 45 hours, ideally, for a postback to show strong academic capability to medical schools. To say, look, it's not 5 hours, it's not 10 hours, it's not 15, it's not 20. This isn't a fluke. This is 40 hours of a postback that I did, and I crushed it. 398. I always talk about get as high as close as you can to a 4.0 as possible, and that's what you did. So great job there. Overall, right, your overall GPA is a 3.26 cumulative undergraduate GPA. So not stellar. And this is where I always like to talk about the story behind the numbers. Because you were talking about Reddit and Student Doctor earlier. Students will go onto Reddit and Student Doctor Network and say, okay, I have a 3.26 cumulative GPA. What are my chances? And when you just look at that number, it's not a great number. But it doesn't show the story behind with a 3.98 science GPA in your last 41 credits. That is phenomenal. We get to your MCAT score. You took it April of 2021, and you didn't do so hot with cars, not surprisingly, being your worst score. The MCAT is notorious for punishing ESL students. Talk about when you got your score back and in your preparation for the MCAT. Were you expecting to not do great on the cars? What was that process like for you?
Well, I want to say that I truthfully felt that I could have, I, my desire was to improve, but I couldn't. I tried every single technique. I tried meditation. I think that I expected something slightly higher on the car section. But other than that, I was very pleased. I had a lot of things going on in my life during that MCAT preparation. Of course, it's something I wouldn't recommend anyone to have any life-changing events, but I did. And I sadly, my score did not improve. I tried to prepare for the MCAT twice. So in 2020, I was not able to get through the course. But what is surprising to me is that the grade that I got on my full lengths, the scores on 2020 are the exact same on the 2021 preparation I did, and are the exact same scores that I got on the actual test. So I think that for me, I was very happy that I had a score high on the things that I knew I could.
Yeah.
And I was very shocked about sociology and psychology because I had never taken any college course in sociology and psychology. So that was self-taught, and that was my highest grade.
Yeah. And that's a good one to self-teach because it's just a lot of memorization. So you did a great job there. Overall, a good score, right? It's average typically. I think the like average for everyone now is shifted a little bit to closer to a 501. But right, 500 is statistically supposed to be the average for the MCAT, and that's where you landed. For someone who didn't do great at all for the car section, a 500 is still a phenomenal score. So again, not if you were to go post on Student Doctor Network and say, okay, I have a 3.26 cumulative GPA and a 500 MCAT, you would be kind of shunned and be like, why are you applying to medical school? Like, go fix all of that. And the story behind the numbers says these are actually pretty good. So great job with that. When you got your score back, was there a potential thought of like, do I apply? Do I not apply? Should I retake the MCAT? Like, what was the thought process there?
Well, I planned a trip. I was not at home. I knew that whatever way was going to be the score, I wanted to be a place where if I cried out of happiness or sadness, I was going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
I did have a lot of doubts. Something that I would like to people know is how important it is your mental health in this process. Because if you're not emotionally grounded, you will make the decisions out of fear or out of, desperation. And at least for me, at that point between the time I took the MCAT, I started reading your book, your personal statement book. And I was already working on a personal statement. So in some regards, my personal statement convinced me to apply to medical school, even after getting that grade, that
Nice.
score.
That's awesome. Okay. All right. So let's talk about your activities now. So you have some medical clinical stuff here. The dates are redacted out, so that's kind of a bummer. But knowing how the MCAS PDF works is that stuff that ended the latest is what is at the top. So we'll assume the stuff at the top is the newest stuff. And how I like to have students write activity descriptions is through storytelling showing impact. And that's where you kind of did that, but mostly didn't. And we'll talk about some of the things that I think could be improved, and talk about the things that worked well. Right, so your first couple here, this community service and the physician shadowing, you tried to get into a little bit of storytelling. You started to go down that path with this statement of like, I recall some Hispanic patients were distrustful of the process, and you tried to connect with them, right? Showing your ability to connect with these patients. Same thing with this shadowing is during a physical with a female patient who seemed anxious. I was touched by her empathy and compassion, talking about the doctor. All right, you're showing this story through the activity description, which is better than I did this, 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 right? Job description, basic job description stuff. So you kind of were bordering on almost telling that story. And so that's where it potentially could have been even better. Where I think you went down a path for a lot of your activity descriptions, which I recommend most students don't, if not all students. And that's just my style, right? You obviously got into medical school, so regardless of what I recommend, it worked well enough for you. And that is selling yourself. I'm not a big fan of selling yourself through the application. And here's where you did that, right? Getting into your teaching, tutoring, and teaching assistant activity here, you have this activity made me think on my feet and helped me develop effective communication skills, and allowed me or required me to deliver complex technical information tailored to students, and provided me insight into how physician-patient interactions will be. It's very, very common for students to make a list of everything that they assume being a physician is. Being a physician is being able to think on your feet. Being a physician is being able to develop or have effective communication skills. Being a physician requires delivering lots of complex information so that patients understand. And students take that list and then they try to force all of their narrative, all of the descriptions and personal statement and everything else into fitting that mold and checking off all of the boxes. Like, okay, I have on my list that to be a good doctor, you have to have good communication skills. Okay, as a tutor, as a teaching assistant, I'm going to show them that I have good communication skills. Okay, good, check, I'm done. Right? And that is a very common thing that students do. And for me, it doesn't show me who you are. It just shows me who you think you need to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's where I get into, like, don't sell yourself. Show me you, show me your impact, show me your truth. And this is more forced. I'm making sure I'm going off of this checklist. And that's probably the biggest thing that you did throughout, was trying to force this narrative of like, I have this skill and I have that skill and this skill and that skill. And again, that's just not what I recommend. The other thing that you did, which is very common, is trying to tie everything into medicine. So your next one here is your research and lab experience, talking about the scientific concepts and practice, allowed you to master many techniques in synthetic organic chemistry. Great. But then the takeaway that I highlighted here, this experience has helped ground me for the things that lie ahead, both in training and implementation phases of a career in medicine. So again, it's very common for students to go, here's this activity, and here's how it's prepared me to be a doctor. I like to think of it as, here's this activity, and here's the impact that it had on me. So you're not kind of forcing this weird, in my mind, a false narrative of, I'm showing you how everything is preparing me for medicine, and I'm just showing you who I am and the impact that these things have had on me. That makes the application much more personal, I think. Mm-hmm. So again, we get into just other activities that you kind of make the same kind of things, same kind of mistakes in my mind to make them stronger. But again, you got into medical school, so who am I? So again, I just highlighted a couple other things here of this poster presentation, this national case study. Appreciate the importance of teamwork, right? You had on your checklist that being a doctor requires teamwork. Community service volunteer here. You have made me realize the valuable joint role of allied healthcare specialists in disease management, right? Here's this thing and here's how it's prepared me for medicine because now I understand the role of all of these people. Ability to multitask. So again, just a very common kind of same theme over and over again of the sales pitch, which again, it worked well enough for you. I want to talk about your hospital registration job. You have it marked here as a most meaningful experience. I typically tell students that being a registration person is not clinical experience. I would love for you to sell me on why it is, because you put it as clinical experience.
Well, for me, even though it had a lot to do with processes and orders, and the hospital that I was working on was really small. I was the only registrar many times, the only one in the entire hospital. Wow. So sometimes I had to do things that I wasn't even supposed to do. But my job required me to pretty much be proactive. Whenever I was thinking about my personal statement, I did a timeline because I think you made me aware that I had a seed, but I didn't know where it was. Mm-hmm. When I went back, I realized when was that it had started. And to me, what happened was that as a registrar and in an ER and in such a small organization, I was not able to interact with the medical stuff per se, like in hands-on patient interaction. But I was there in the visit many times because it was rushed, because the operational part of it was sometimes I even was translating for patients, even though, again, that was not even my position.
Yeah.
And that's why probably I don't disclose that. But for me, it was clinical in the sense that I still had the patient interaction that I should not have had based on my position, based on the role, regardless of the title of the experience. Perfect. It was what was meaningful for me.
Perfect answer, right? And students will come to me and be like, well, here's my job title. And I'm always like, the job title doesn't tell me anything. What were you doing? And so that's why I wanted to check in with you, because typically a normal registrar is it's more admin of like, what's your insurance number? And okay, now you're in the system, the doctors can do their thing. But it sounds like because it was a smaller hospital, it sounds like it was a great experience and you were able to do a lot more. So perfect. That makes great sense. And you got into a story here, right? Of like one day a boy in critical condition arrived, and you get into this story, which I love. You gotta love the stories. All right, so again, just more sales stuff. I don't need to pick out everything. You have this community service volunteer that, again, you have listed as medical clinical. This awareness campaign for this fall spring. It sounds like maybe it was a international trip that you were fundraising for. Did you go on the trip, or were you just kind of fundraising and stuff for it?
No, I did not ended up going on the trip. Okay. The trip it's all volunteer, and financially wasn't something I could do. But I did try to contact doctors, medical staff. We did the packing. Yep. We would pack all the stuff for each person that was going to have the surgery. So it was all that logistics, the purchasing, all the operational part that for me, it created a lot of a different awareness in the medical field that I did not have. Yeah. And for me, it was interacting with stuff behind scenes.
Yeah, Perfect. So I probably wouldn't label that medical clinical, even though you're kind of in the medical field and interacting with all these doctors. Right? For the strict definition of what we talk about medical clinical for an application, it's usually that interaction with patients. So not a huge thing. You have other clinical experience. You weren't relying on this one as your only clinical experience. So at the end of the day, the school probably looked at that and were like, probably not clinical, but we have other experiences to lean on. So not a problem. How you could make this one specifically stronger is by talking about numbers. I love talking numbers for these types of experiences. How much money was raised? How much money did you have to spend to procure all of this, all of these supplies and medications for these patients that these physicians were going to be treating and operating on, or whatever that looked like? Right? How many doctors and nurses did you have to coordinate with? How many patients were going to be affected by the work that you were doing? Showing impact through numbers for these types of experiences specifically works really, really well.
Mhm.
Um,
I also wanted to mention
yeah.
something. Something that I remember reading in your book was to kind of get their interest to know more. And I think one of the things that worked for me to supplement the application were the secondaries. I don't think you have access to the one of them because I forgot to send it, but I did remember that, and I tried to include some numbers there. But
Good.
I do agree with you that I think sometimes the graphs or the visual makes the story more appealing. It actually makes you visualize it.
Yeah. Good insight there. You have a leadership experience here, and you start off immediately with this story, right? Rounding on a patient who is soon to be discharged, blah, 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 right? Great. Love stories. Again, getting into that visualization, I'm able to see what's going on there. So that's great. So that was a good experience for you, big experience. This other leadership experience where you say, hey, my responsibility for this event was to coordinate volunteers. How many volunteers, right? Getting back into numbers. How many volunteers there? And then our last experience here, again, just kind of the same old kind of sales pitch of like tying it into medicine. Same kind of story throughout. So we get through your experiences. You have shadowing, you have clinical experience, you got a little research experience in there, you got some leadership experiences. Very, very well-rounded student, very well-rounded applicant, on top of this story of you being a mom too that we read about in your institutional action. So again, it gives context. You were able to sneak that in there about being a mom because it was your truth into why that institutional action was there, but it gives context to everything else that I am reading. So everything looks good so far. And then we get into your personal statement, and your personal statement again is good. I've seen much worse. I've seen better, but it's good enough to tell the story about why you're doing this, right? You start with this story of being in this jungle in your dad's semi-truck, and how it was an adventure, and the kind of lack of healthcare access because people were scared to go to hospitals for one reason or another. So really good job kind of painting that picture, that seed that you were talking about earlier that I talk about in the book. Again, I understand the journey that you've been on, and I understand why you're doing it to this point. And that's the goal of the personal statement. Show me this journey that you've been on and why you're here. So really good job with that. You have a little bit of timeline stuff with coming to the States and kind of struggling here and there and everywhere with just kind of, again, cultural stuff and kind of the healthcare system and where you struggled and do I want to be a doctor or can I be a doctor? Probably not super necessary for the personal statement because a lot of it you've already laid out for us in the disadvantaged essay. So you could have potentially had some room for more storytelling, more impact through your activities. You have a red flag paragraph in here that I call the red flag statement about your low grades. And here you say, oh, actually, it's not just the one kid that I was pumping for. I have two kids. And so again, context, it's your truth. Let me help you understand part of my journey, where I've struggled, potentially why I've struggled, and hopefully it will give you the reassurance that I can do this. Because look at my postback grades. I did do this. And then just from, again, a personal statement standpoint, a reflection standpoint, reflecting on these experiences and why they've led you to want to be a physician, I think that slipped away a little bit. You have this reflection at your second to last paragraph with, this experience gave me assurance that I chose the right path. Okay, I read that, I'm like, okay, great. Why? And then you said, I felt trusted and a sense of gratification when I saw the patient feel comforted. So that is a very internal kind of reason. And I talk about it from an internal, external standpoint of, are you doing this because you want to feel good, or are you doing this because you want the patients to feel good? And you kind of snuck it in there a little bit of both when you said, I want the patients to feel comforted too. So you snuck it in there a little bit with the patient, but it could have been a little bit more focused on the patient. So we get to your conclusion, and I love this last statement here. As a physician, I envision merging my passion for reducing the barriers in healthcare rooted in my childhood experience with my desire to heal and advocate for patients through the use of medicine. Very powerful kind of mission-driven statement, which I love. So good job with that. And that's everything in your application. You applied to a bunch of schools. Did you get FAP?
Oh,
The fee assistance? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So fee assistance, just for everyone watching, allows students to apply to 20 schools, which is great. And so you applied to a bunch of schools, and you ended up getting, I think, several interviews and at least one acceptance, which is awesome. What was that feeling like when you got that first acceptance?
So I have had 3 interviews. I have 2 acceptances.
Woohoo!
And I was, waking up with my kids, and I got the phone call, and they were telling me that I had gotten accepted. I mean, when I saw the number, it was from that state, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're gonna call me, tell me that I'm rejected or something.
They wouldn't waste a phone call on a rejection.
Yeah, that's what everyone said. You wouldn't be the odd student that they called to say sorry, but you're just that, right? But I was with my kids, and I really, I felt really good about the fact. I feel very trusted. I guess it was like, wow, what now, kind of thing. And now I'm, one of them is MD, and one of them is DO, and I'm seriously thinking about which one will be the best fit for my family and I.
Yeah, this is the perfect place to be is being able to make those decisions. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Is there anything else you want to share with the listeners, the watchers watching this right now?
Well, I wanted to share a couple of tips one of them is the books. Your books are very helpful.
Thank you.
One of the things that I also did during my preparation was meditation. I learned how to, especially for the MCAT, because I don't know about other applicants, but whenever I'm reading that passage, my mind is starting to, will I get in? Will I not? Will I get in? And then you start listing seconds, right? So I did meditation building up to the test. And I was able to have it down by the time I went to the test. I also did therapy sessions. I did EMDR therapy, which I simulated the test setting. And because I would get very anxious, I would sweat all the time and just get very anxious. And even with my writing, reflecting a lot of why is it that you want to do. And sometimes you don't know your seat, like me. I didn't know that the seat had been there for years. Yeah. I always knew it was healthcare. I didn't know why, how, when. And it was really reading your book a couple of times to really realize what was my seat.
Yeah. That's awesome. It's hard. It's a really big exercise for students to think about their journey, to think about their past, and to understand why they're sitting here today. So great job with that work.
Thank you. Thank you. And you help a lot. I mean, I've watched a couple, like how I said, didn't watch too much. I did not have an advisor. I would not recommend people going to advisors, but that's a personal decision, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your story and helping others follow in your footsteps.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.